Welcome back, critical thinkers. Today we're going to be talking about a central theme of our class. We're going to be talking about the concept of an argument. And this isn't the idea of a fight, right? This is about really sort of the central way of organizing our thoughts whenever we sit down to ask the question, how do we know it's true? Well, how do we know it's true about what? And really, it's the idea is how do we know how to answer questions? How do we know how to answer everyday questions like what should I have for breakfast? Or more profound questions like who should I vote for? How do we find truth sort of addresses this concept of I want to ask and answer questions about the world? And the organizing sort of central framework for that is a concept called an argument. And so everyone should have the lecture notes entitled Arguments at their disposal right now. And we should just start on the very first slide, right? Are we all ready? All right, good. So when we talk about the foundations of argumentation, we're not talking about two people screaming at each other from across the room, right? That's our everyday understanding of two people having an argument. And while it is true that two people who are having a heated debate or two people who are engaged in a vicious fight do in fact have two opposing arguments, which is where we get that use of that word, right? We're having an argument because you and I are having an argument or a fight or some conflict because I have a point of view that's different from yours. And so really an argument is a point of view. I have a different argument than yours. And so I want you to leave behind this definition of an argument as a fight. That's not the one we're going to use in this class. In our class, an argument is a point of view about a question that's backed up by evidence. That's what an argument is, right? So moving on to our second slide, what we're going to learn is when you sort of use this organizing concept called an argument to try to figure out what's true about the world, it really has three components. And the three components of an argument then, sort of the structure of the argument, is going to be first the question itself. Whenever you're trying to figure out what's true about the world, you should probably start out with some really formal question. And good critical thinkers won't just have an opinion, but will explicitly state the question or controversy under consideration in the moment, right? Like let's say I think that we shouldn't raise tuition here at Pierce. A good critical thinker acknowledges that there's some question that underlies that attitude, that point of view. A good critical thinker recognizes that there's a question there. Should we raise tuition at Pierce? That's what we call the issue or controversy under consideration. It's the question itself. And all good arguments acknowledge that no matter what your opinion, no matter what your point of view, there's either a stated or an unstated, which means implied, meaning the question is there, but it's just implied. There is some question that you're attempting to answer. And so, of course, that's the first feature of any argument. The second feature is really going to be your answer to that question, right? You have a question about the world, and eventually you're going to decide how to answer that question. That's what we call the conclusion. But our argument is not complete, because just because you can ask a question and then answer it does not make it an argument. In order to say something is a complete argument, you have to ask a question, answer that question, but then back up that conclusion with reasons. That means evidence, right? That means support for your point of view. If it's just an answer to the question, that's just an attitude, right? If you just ask the question, that's just a controversy. And if it's just a question and an answer, well, that's a pretty poor argument indeed without any reasons to back it up. So the three essential components of any argument in this class, well, let's call it an academic argument, but you can use it in everyday life too. And a good critical thinker will. Any good argument, which is the structure and a foundation of any critical thought, is going to have a question called the issue, an answer to that question, which we call the conclusion, and then some evidence to back it up, which we call reasons or premises. Moving on to slide 3. And so if we think about where we get this everyday understanding of sort of an argument as a fight, I think it's because that's how we treat divergent points of view, right? When people don't agree, it's almost like people go to war. And that's not a good way of figuring out what's true. Automatically assuming that someone who disagrees with you is just wrong is just a terrible way of finding truth. And so I think our everyday understanding of debate and opposing points of view as necessarily fights, necessarily conflicts, we have to leave it behind. And that's hard because it's sort of embedded in our language. So if you think about it, when we say that two people are having an argument or someone is making an argument, here are the metaphors that sort of come out and how we talk about that disagreement, right? Your claims about the world are indefensible. Like someone has to defend themselves. They have to defend their point of view. With a shield, with a sword? How am I going to defend myself? It's a really conflict-laden language, right? Or someone came up to me and I just demolished his argument. Like demolish, like his argument's a wall? Like I have to bomb it? Was there a tank involved? Right? Or two people are fighting and one person says to the other, oh, you disagree with me? Okay, you go ahead, shoot. Come on, give me your reasons. Again, there's all this language that suggests really warfare. And in this class, this is not what's called a rhetoric class. Right? Rhetoric is like the science of persuasion. Like, how am I going to get someone to see my point of view? And although that has a place when we discuss critical thinking, it's sort of the last step, right? Once we're 100% sure we're right about the world, then we can figure out how to convince other people. But that is the last step. Critical thinking is about deciding for yourself what's probably true about the world, or what is certainly true about the world once we have enough evidence, right? And so the idea of an argument is not going to be the idea of a fight in this class. And when we engage in disagreement, if and when we engage in disagreement about what is true, we're going to make arguments, but I don't want us to make fights. I don't want us to make this idea that if someone gives us a point of view, asks a question, gives us a conclusion, gives us our reasons, we may disagree, and we may refute their argument, which means disagree with it, but not in such a way where we're engaged in warfare, right? We got to leave those metaphors behind. They're not appropriate in a class like this. Moving on to slide 4. So, something I see in your future, meaning maybe on an exam, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, is basically knowing what the 3 essential components of an argument are. When someone has a point of view, when someone wants to make an argument, they have to be arguing a particular question. So whenever you have a complete argument, when you say someone has made a complete argument, you have to be able to identify that specific question. And this is where things start to get a little technical. But I think it's really important as a good critical thinker that we have the ability to get technical. And what I mean by that is that we need to have the ability to break down our thoughts. We have to be able to break down our thoughts into their individual separate components. And an argument, being able to separate all of our thoughts and attitudes into their separate individual arguments, is an essential place to start. So when I ask, what is an argument? What is a complete argument? It is one single question, one controversy, right? Not a whole slew of questions, but one specific question, right? That I have decided to answer in a particular way, that's my conclusion, that I've supported with some specific reasons that support that question. So let me give you an example of a complete argument that fits this formal definition. And if it feels formal, that's because it is. This is a technical definition of an argument. This idea that there's one question. For example, who should do the dishes tonight? So I didn't just bring up this big topic, the dishes, right? I asked and I didn't ask the question, who's been doing dishes for the last month? I didn't ask that question. That would be a different issue. But I asked a very specific question, who should do the dishes tonight? Do you hear how specific that question is? And a good argument is specific. It narrows itself into a particular question, one question, with a matching answer to that question. Here would be a matching answer to that question. Who should do the dishes tonight? You should do the dishes tonight. Now we have a conclusion, a synonym for which is claim. Now we have a conclusion that matches that issue, right? So here would be an example of something incorrect in an argument. Who should do the dishes tonight? I have done the dishes for the last month. Wait. That is not a good conclusion to that question. Because you hear how I didn't answer the question? What I asked was who should do the dishes tonight? And that wasn't the conclusion I gave, right? The conclusion I gave seemed to be about a whole other issue, right? So a good academic argument, a good technically correct argument will ask a specific question with the correct matching answer. Who should do the dishes tonight? You should do the dishes tonight. Or, who should do the dishes tonight? I should do the dishes tonight. Do you see how I'm answering the specific question that I asked? And so a good technical argument has that matching quality. It answers the specific question that it asked, and it keeps its questions separate. And then the last component are the reasons, a synonym for which is premise. So here's an example of reasons that match the argument that I'm trying to make. Who should do the dishes tonight? You should do the dishes tonight. Now comes that important piece of information. I have done dishes every night for the last month. It's not a conclusion, but rather it's a reason to back up the idea that someone else should do the dishes. And now I have a complete argument. Who should do the dishes tonight? Well, I have done dishes every night for the last month. Therefore, you should do the dishes tonight. Now, that's a pretty brief argument, right? And one could argue that it's too brief to be a quality argument. However, it is a complete technical argument, as we've defined argument in this class. It's got a specific question, who should do the dishes? It's got a specific matching conclusion, you should do the dishes. And it's got a reason that matches and actually does support the question and answer. I have done dishes every night for the last month. And that is a complete argument. A question, issue, an answer to that question, conclusion, and some reasons to back up that answer to that question. And that is a complete argument. And this is a foundational idea for this class. We're going to keep returning to this because we're going to learn about lots of different kinds of issues. And we're going to learn about how we ask and answer the questions that underlie different kinds of issues. And so it's important that we understand this sort of basic building block of this class. What is an academic technical argument? It's issue, reasons, and conclusion. So here are some examples of specific issues. And notice how specific they are. If you want to sort of always make sure that your arguments have an appropriate issue, is just always ask a question. Now, it can sometimes be a controversy, like whether or not I should do the dishes tonight, right? I didn't phrase that as something that I would have a question mark at the end, but I could, right? Whether or not I should do the dishes tonight could be rephrased as, should I do the dishes tonight? And so you know that you have an issue when the statement is a question or could be rephrased as a question. Because that's what an issue is. It's a question. So here are some examples. Should the minimum wage be raised? Definitely a question, right? It's something that you need to have an answer to. It's not just a statement. Should energy drinks be regulated? Should hip-hop music be banned? Right? These are just questions. And so they're issues. Moving on to slide 6. But be careful. You got to be careful. Because a lot of times students confuse topics with issues, right? So let's use the example of one of the questions from the previous slide. Should hip hop music be banned? The issue is that specific question. But maybe there are but maybe you say, well, no, the issue is hip hop music. No. For the purposes of this class, the topic is hip-hop music, right? The topic is hip-hop music. The topic is censorship. But the specific issue is should hip-hop music be banned, right? So maybe you say, yeah, but there's lots of other things, ideas that surround that question. And that's a great point. One issue is often informed by other issues, right? Like, for example, well, what is offensive about hip hop music? Or what is awesome about hip hop music? These are different issues, right? Different issues that might inform the question. Is censorship wrong? Is another issue that might inform the question about whether or not schools or governments or organizations should ban hip hop music. No, I actually don't think hip hop music should be banned. Hip hop is awesome, right? I don't think anything should be banned. I'm not a fan of censorship. But the idea that I'm trying to point out to you is that an argument is always about one question. Now, a person, when they're trying to persuade you of something, may make several arguments, and that's totally fine. One question, when you answer it, will often lead to other issues, which will then lead to other answers, which will then lead you to other questions and other answers. But the first step in being a good critical thinker is having the ability to recognize that different questions have to be handled independently. Let's go back to my example of who's going to do the dishes tonight. So maybe when I say to my partner, hey, who should do the dishes tonight? I've done dishes every night for the last month, so I think you should do the dishes tonight. That's my complete argument. But then my partner says to me, oh, ho, ho, not so fast. Have you done dishes every night for the last month? In fact, you have not. I did dishes 3 times last week. Do you see how that's a totally separate issue, right? Have I in fact done dishes every night for the last month is a separate issue. Now, if my partner, but then we need to address that separately. And a good critical thinker has that ability, has the ability to address different issues, which are different questions, separately. It's just easier. It's easier to stumble upon truth. It's easier to figure out what's true is as new issues come up, as new questions come up, you address them separately. When my partner says to me, I don't think that you have done dishes every day for the last month, we need to now address that topic before we can move back to the previous issue, which is who should do them tonight. And this is true no matter how profound the question. Because let's come up with a different one. Let's talk about something controversial like abortion, right? When someone says, I think it's wrong I think abortion is wrong. So the issue is, should abortion be legally permissible? And they say, no, I don't think abortion should be legally permissible because I think that taking a human life is immoral. Well, then someone else says, well, I actually don't believe that taking a human life is always immoral. Well, now we have a new issue, right? Is taking a human life always immoral? Well, that's a totally separate issue that needs to be addressed, theoretically, before we can move back to the previous argument of should abortion be legally permissible. And life is complicated, right? No question no larger policy issue, no larger topic can be answered usually with one issue. But that's sort of the point, right? The point is a good critical thinker can go, okay, what are all the different issues that sort of feed into this larger topic, right? And recognize that a single topic, whether it's abortion or the dishes tonight, one single topic often has several issues that really, if you want to be a good thinker, should be handled separately, right? Well, let's answer one question before we move on to the next question. And then if other questions come up, we'll address those separately as well. So let's take an example in slide 7. So here we have a single topic of cell phones, right? A single topic of cell phones. And so here are several different separate questions, so separate issues that each can create its own separate argument. Do cell phones have too many applications? Of course not. Cell phones can never have too many applications, would be the conclusion or claim to that issue. Why? What are my reasons? Because applications are awesome and they're super fun. So how could a phone ever have too many, right? Now I have a complete argument. Do cell phones have too many applications? No, cell phones do not have too many applications. My reasons are applications are by default always fun. Therefore, more applications is always good because I love fun and I love things to have more applications so that they are fun. Right? That's the idea. Another issue, though, might be, should cell phones be allowed at school? And I might say, yes, cell phones should be allowed at school. Students might have emergencies where their family needs to get a hold of them. And now I have a complete argument. Should cell phones be allowed at school? Yes, cell phones should be allowed at school. My reason? Because students need to have their phones in case of emergency. And all of these are just really basic arguments, right? Most well-crafted arguments are not as simple as this. But we got to walk before we run, and so I'm just giving you examples of very basic arguments with one issue, one reason, and one conclusion. Good arguments, quality arguments are not as simple as I'm making them right now. But our first step to become a critical thinker is to be able to basically pinpoint and separate our thoughts into their separate questions. So we got to learn the definition of a technical argument. 3 other separate issues. Are cell phones a danger to your health? See how specific a question that is? The issue. Should cell phones be allowed in the classrooms? A different issue, right? Related, but different issue to should they be allowed at school at all, right? We got to learn to separate our thoughts. Can cell phones detract from safety? And so then you ask a different issue. Well, what do you mean by safety? Now we have a different issue. So an issue is a separate, distinct, individual question that you can ask around a given topic, such as cell phones. Moving on to slide 8. And so if you're going to craft an excellent argument, let's say you're writing some persuasive essay for a class or something like that, you usually want to introduce the topic, right? Introduce the topic in some compelling way, and then broach your question, introduce your question, right? Lay some truth on people, give them some compelling reasons, building up towards your point of view. A synonym for which is your premises. Here is what I presume to be true about the world. Here are my premises. And then lay some conclusion or claim on them at the end, right? That is like sort of, that I think is the best way to craft a good quality argument. Introduce the topic, ask the specific question, start handing out some really good evidence, and then finally at the end make your claim or state your conclusion. So moving on to slide 9, sort of broaches the question, how do I know an issue when I see one? Or what if somebody doesn't explicitly state their issue? Because that happens a lot, right? Let's say you're watching some political debate, right? Or you're watching some political speech, or you're reading some article in some magazine, and you're like, what is this person really trying to say? Like, what question are they really trying to answer here? Right? And they don't explicitly state it, right? They don't come out and say, should abortion be legally permissible? Or should we raise tuition? Let's say they don't actually explicitly come out and state their issue. A good critical thinker will be able to detect that issue, like you're a detective, right? And so remember, an issue is always the question. It's always the thing that could go in multiple directions, right? No matter what you happen to believe about whether or not tuition should be raised, right? When I ask the question, should tuition be raised, there's multiple ways of answering that question. Yes, tuition should be raised. No, tuition should not be raised. Who should do the dishes tonight? You should do the dishes. I should do the dishes. No one does the dishes, and we live in squalor. Now, whatever, there's multiple ways of answering the question, right? And so the issue is that question or controversy that could go more than one way, right? So the idea, I'm trying to figure out something about, let's say, violence on TV, right? And I hear two people arguing back and forth. One person, arguing about how horrible violence is on television and, it's the end of civilization as we know it because of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And another person is arguing the opposite, right? That there's something wrong with violence on television, not a big deal. whether or not either person explicitly states it, there is clearly an issue under debate, right? And that issue is there too much violence on television, right? Whether or not there's too much violence on television, that's the idea. The issue is the question, it's the controversy, it's not the answer to the question, and it's not any specific evidence. It's just the question itself. Moving on to slide 10. So I think a good skill that I see in your future, like maybe on your exam, is to be able to detect issues, right? To be able to understand the issue that is under debate, even if nobody explicitly states the question. Can you pull the question out of some persuasive argument, right? Let's say I'm ranting and raving all about tuition. Again, let's just use tuition. And I'm ranting and raving about the college and how the college doesn't have enough money and how I really think tuition should be raised. A good critical thinker can say, the issue under debate here is whether or not tuition should be raised. Should tuition be raised here at Pierce, right? That's the issue that is left unstated by my ranting and raving. And a good critical thinker can pull that out and say, well, you really asked a question here about whether or not it should be raised, so let's talk about that question, right? And so a good critical thinker also can make sure everyone stays on topic, right? So if someone is discussing whether or not tuition should be raised, and then another person starts bringing up the cost of books, maybe you decide as a group to start discussing the cost of books, but recognize that you sort of jumped to a different issue. You jumped to a different question, right? And a good critical thinker can either point that out, okay, well, now we're talking about something different. Maybe the cost of books is relevant to that other issue, but let's make sure we all agree about what the cost of books is and how it relates to this question before we move back to the original issue, which is whether or not tuition should be raised at Pierce. It's a good skill to have. And also, just basic issue detection. Can you pull out the single question? And being able to recognize the single question is a useful skill. Moving on to slide 11. So, so for the purposes of this class, so now that we have a working definition of an issue, of an argument, issues, reasons, and conclusion, let's sort of break down our understanding of issues a little more now. So now what we understand is that there's really this formal definition of an issue, which is a specific question or controversy. Well, now we need to recognize that not every question is the same. Not all issues are exactly the same. And so although we could probably classify different types of questions in a variety of ways, for the purposes of this class, we're going to really classify different types of questions into one of three camps. We're going to talk about value issues, which are questions all about people's values. We call them prescriptive. They're sort of questions about how the world ought to be in terms of good or bad, right or wrong. There are factual issues, which are going to be questions about what are the facts. What is the world like? How do we define things? What do you mean by that is sort of the basic idea behind a factual issue. And the last one is a policy issue. So what we're now going to be jumping into is the recognition that there's more than one kind of question. And so not all questions are created equal, right? And different types of questions, which we call issues, some of them we can agree to disagree on. Others of them, it's sort of intellectually lazy to agree to disagree. So it's important to recognize and be able to recognize these three different types of issues: value issues, factual issues, and policy issues. And we'll take them one at a time. Slide 12. So what is a value issue? Well, a value issue is a question about good or bad, right or wrong. That's what it is. And here are some examples of prescriptive values, which is really like a prescription, like I'm a doctor and I'm writing a prescription about the world. A value issue is about the way you think the world ought to be in terms of good or bad. You're asking a question about sort of the worth of things. Are they valuable? Are they important? Ought the world be this way? Should the world be this way? Right? That is an example of a value issue. So here's an example. Is there too much violence on television? Well, according to who? What do you mean by too much? Right? When you say, is there too much, there's really an implied good or bad, right or wrong. When you say, is there too much violence on television, there's this subtle idea that violence is bad, right? Well, if there can be too much, I guess violence must not be a very good thing, right? Well, and so there's that subtle idea. Or if I say, is there too much salt in this food? Well, what do you mean by too much? Too much in terms of taste? Too much in terms of cholesterol? What do you mean by too much? But that phrase, too much, suggests we're talking about something that is a value issue. You're trying to ask a question about the worth of something, about the goodness of something, about the badness of something, right? A similar kind of issue is, are salaries of executives, CEOs, too high? Too high? What do you mean by too high? Right? But you hear how this is about how the way the world ought to be, right? Maybe I think that violence is wrong. So that's why I'm asking the question, is there too much violence on TV? What do you mean by too much? Maybe I think that it's a bad thing if executives make too much money. So that's why I'm asking the question, are the salaries of executives too high? It's this sort of language that suggests we're talking about a value issue, which are going to be informed, right? How I answer this question, is there too much violence on TV? Are executive salaries too high? They're going to be informed by my values, the things that I think are important about the world, right? And so it's important to recognize when we've stumbled across a value issue. This is different than a factual issue. Now, a factual issue is one where agreeing to disagree is intellectually lazy. Because this is asking about what are the facts. To use our examples from before, is there too much violence on television? It would be a value issue. A question about goodness or badness, about how the world ought to be in terms of what I think is moral, what I think is good. But now let me ask a different question and see if you can detect the difference. A different question is, how much violence is on television? Well, that's a factual issue. Not, is the violence on TV good? Is the violence on TV bad? But how much is there? That's a factual issue. Or, does watching violent television increase aggression? Also a factual issue. I can check it against reality, right? And that's how you know you can detect a factual issue. Could you check it against the real world? If you can check, however you answer the question, how much violence is there on television, you could go check, right? You could go watch the television, start keeping track of how much violence is on there, and answer that question by looking at the real world. So it's a factual issue. Now, or asking the question, does violence on TV lead to increased aggression? Well, that's also a factual issue. Maybe it's not one that we can easily answer in 5 minutes. Maybe we need a series of research studies where we carefully control how much violence TV people watch, and we carefully control and watch how much aggression they have. And that all sounds super hard, but eventually we can try to answer that question by looking at the world, by looking at how much violent TV people watch, by controlling how much TV they watch possibly, and then sort of tracking their aggression. Does violence on TV lead to greater aggression? We could theoretically check that question against the real world and come to some answer. Maybe not 100% certain answer, but it's sort of lazy to say, well, we should just agree to disagree. I don't think violence on TV leads to more aggression. Well, it's nice to have that opinion, but is that opinion backed up by some actual evidence? So factual issues are the kinds of issues where we either have to go look at what reality tells us about the world and then answer the question, or agree to say the evidence is inconclusive. We're not sure whether or not watching violent TV leads to aggression because maybe there hasn't been enough research yet to answer that question. But to simply say that one person who says no, violence does not lead to greater aggression, and another person who says yes, violence on TV leads to greater aggression. To say that both of these opinions are equal is intellectually lazy. So factual issues are the ones where we need to gather the most evidence. Value issues are going to be informed by people's individual morality, people's individual value structure. And so those are the kind of questions where we might be able to reasonably say we agree to disagree. So being able to recognize when factual issues are under debate versus value issues becomes incredibly important. So when we talk about value issues, when we talk about factual issues, and we're on slide 13 now, we're really talking about two different types. They're what are called descriptive factual issues, which is about questions that have a sort of a true or false answer. For example, are small controlled devices effective at preventing pollution? Well, they either are or they're not, right? This is what we call an empirical question, where we go and gather empirical evidence. Well, empirical evidence just means real-world evidence, right? We look at it, we grab 100 cars, we slap small controlled devices on half of them, the other half we have no small controlled devices, and when we just see, okay, are the ones with the devices spewing out less pollution? Well, I guess they work. This is a different question to whether or not clean air is a good thing. That would be a value issue, right? Is pollution a bad thing? That would be a value issue. Do small controlled devices prevent pollution? That is a factual issue, specifically a descriptive factual issue. Another type of factual issue is something we call definitional. And this is the kind of issue where we have to agree on our terms. So when I say, okay, do mammals nurse their young? Well, what do you mean by that? Define mammal. And so then I go, okay, well, let's just make sure we know what we're talking about when I say the word mammal. What is a mammal? And so a definitional factual issue is making sure that we're all talking about the same idea. We're all talking about the same category in the same way. Because let's say I'm a scientist and I research platypuses. And I start talking about sort of the nursing habits of platypuses, and I'm trying to make parallels between platypuses and other mammals. And they're like, wait, is a platypus a mammal? And I go, oh yes, actually, a platypus is in fact a mammal, because here's the definition of a mammal, and do you see how platypuses fit into this definition? Platypi have fur, it's one of the definitions of a mammal. Platypi nurse their young. Other definition of a mammal, right? And so we can say that a platypus, yes, fits into our category. So is a platypus a mammal is an example of a factual question. Once we've defined our term, mammal, we can definitively say whether or not a platypus fits into that category. So we have factual issues, which how you know a factual issue is when you can check that question against reality. Maybe it would be difficult to do that, but if you theoretically can sort of answer that question by looking out in the world and going, okay, what are the facts, ma'am? What are the facts? Then you know you have a factual issue. Different from a value issue, because these are going to be questions about good or bad, right or wrong, right? Is honesty an important value? That's definitely a value issue, right? It's right there in how I phrase the question. Is capital punishment immoral? Ooh, definitely a value issue, right? Because you see how I can't just look out in reality. I can't just go, okay, world, tell me about, I can't look in the world and go, yep, look at that immoral thing. I can't do that. I have to decide subjectively whether or not capital punishment is immoral. More subtle value issues are questions that use phrases like too much or not enough, right? These are also going to be subtle hints that you're dealing with something called a value as opposed to a factual issue. So, how much do executives make? Well, how much do they make? Factual issue or value issue? What do you think? How much do executives make? Well, that's a factual issue, right? Because I can go check. How much do you make, executive? Write it down. How much do you make, executive? Write it down. I just gather all the executive salaries from the public corporations that are required to report them, and now I can answer this question by checking against reality. Factual issues. How much do executives make? Do they make too much? Now that sounds like a value issue to me. Moving on to slide 14. The last kind of issue is something called a policy issue. And if we're talking about like how we figure out what's true about the world, how do we just make good decisions? How do we decide what to do as a society? Or how do you decide what to do as a family? Or how do you decide what to do as an individual? This is where the rubber meets the road. A policy issue is about what are you going to do? What are you going to do in the world? What decisions are you going to make about your actions, about your behavior, right? And these sorts of questions, these policy issues, these questions about action, these questions about behavior, they're always going to be informed by factual issues, really the answers to factual issues, and the answers, the conclusions to value issues. So if you think about critical thinking as a truth-finding expedition for making good decisions about the world, really we start with figuring out what the facts are. What are the facts? What is true about the world? Then moving on to deciding what do we think is good or bad, right or wrong? What do we think is important? And once we've asked and answered those factual issues, asked and answered those value issues, now we can take the answers to our value and factual questions, and now we can start asking some more compelling policy issues about our behavior, about our action, about what are we actually going to do in the world. And so here's an example of sort of a flow of reasoning where facts and values led us to some action, which would be a policy issue. So let's say I have answered the question, do smog control devices like catalytic converters? These are things that California cars have to have in them. Did you know that? Pro tip, catalytic converters are required by California cars by the state of California. They're supposed to like clean the smog that comes out of the back, right? Not all states make this requirement. In California, we have to get our cars smog checked. That's not something they have to do in, let's say, Minnesota or Nebraska. You don't have to get your car smog checked there. Here you do, because you're required to have a catalytic converter. So let's say I've asked and answered the factual question, do these smog control devices, catalytic converters, work? Do they in fact prevent pollution? And I say yes. They in fact prevent pollution because I have 16 research studies that all show that cars that have catalytic converters, these smog control devices, all spew out less pollution. Do you see how that's the factual issue that I've asked and answered? Okay, great. That issue, we can put it to bed. So now we ask the question, should everyone have access to clean air? Should that be sort of a right that we have in the state of California? Should we have a right to clean air? That certainly sounds like a value issue to me about whether or not people should have a right to something, whether or not there's too much pollution in the air. All of this sounds like value stuff to me. And so let's say I come up with some compelling argument. Everyone should have a right to clean air because breathing air is important for being alive, and everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as stated in our Constitution. And so if you support the Constitution, you should believe that people should have a right to clean air to support their life. So yes, everyone should have clean air available to them. That's how I answer that value issue. And so now I've got two answers to the question. Smog control devices work to prevent pollution. And yes, everyone should have access to clean air, the answer to my value issue. So now that I have these two answers to this question, I have a new question. Should we require in the state of California for everyone to have a catalytic converter on their car? Well, because how I answered those other two issues, that sort of leads me and provides reasons for why I'm going to answer this policy issue this way. Yes, I will support policies that mandate these devices on cars because A, they work, and B, I believe everyone should have access to clean air. So you may have noticed is oftentimes the answers to factual issues and the answers to value issues, these things we call conclusions, become reasons in brand new arguments. For example, policy issue arguments about what we're going to do. All of this is interrelated, right? And all of this builds on each other. One issue leads to the next. One conclusion leads to the next issue. The conclusion to that issue leads to the next issue. But we have to treat these issues as separate. Treat the factual issues as separate from the value issues, and then treat the factual and value issues as separate from the policy issues, and ask and answer them separately. Usually, factual and value issues must be answered first before you can tackle the policy issues. Slide 15. So let's see if we can recognize value versus factual versus policy issues. So, is there too much violence on television? Sounds like a value issue to me. Hear that too much in there? Are seatbelts effective at preventing injury? Well, could I commission a research study to check to see if that's true or false? I certainly could. I could check to see if seatbelts prevent injury. And specifically, this is a descriptive issue. I'm trying to describe the world, right? Do they prevent injury? Is a dolphin a mammal? Sounds like a definition factual issue to me. Once I define what a mammal is, once I check that definition of a mammal, I can decide definitively whether or not dolphins fit into that category. Should the installation of smog control devices be mandatory? This question is definitely a policy issue because I'm not asking is smog bad. I'm not. That would be value. I'm not asking if smog causes illness. That would be a factual issue. I'm asking about the policy of it, the action of it. What should we do? Should we make them mandatory is a policy issue. Moving on to slide 16. So now we've covered the first most important component of any argument is the issue, the stated question, either the stated or the implied question, the controversy, the question that could go either way. And now we know, for the purposes of this class, there's 3 different types, right? There are factual issues, value issues, and policy issues. Well, on the other side of an issue, waiting for it, is the conclusion, and a couple synonyms for a conclusion are position or claim, which is the specific matching answer to the specific question that was asked. And a conclusion must answer the specific question that was asked in order for it to be a good technical academic argument. And so we often will call this the thesis statement or the position or the claim of the person making the argument. It's how the person has answered the question, right? It's the point of view. It's the attitude that the person is taking based on that specific question. That is the conclusion or claim. And so let's move on to slide 17. But before we sort of tackle the topics in slide 17, let's make sure that we understand what I mean when I say issues and conclusions must match. So let's look at the issues from slide 15, and let me give you examples of matching conclusions. Is there too much violence on television? Yes, there's too much violence on television would be the specific answer to that question. Or, no, there's not too much violence on television would be the specific question. This would be an appropriate conclusion to this question. Is there too much violence on television? Now, let me give you an example of answers that would not match this question. Violence is bad for children. That is not a conclusion to that question. That sounds like a reason to me. Or, is there too much violence on television? I don't want to have to watch violence on television. Again, you have not answered the question that you asked. You are either providing me a reason or you're jumping from it to a different issue. If you ask the question, is there too much violence on television? The only way that you can have a proper conclusion to match it is to answer that question. Yes, there's too much violence on television. No, there's not too much violence on television. These are the only acceptable answers. Now, maybe you want to address a different issue. Maybe you want to address the issue of, well, how much violence on television is there? Well, then you could answer that question. There are 30 violent acts in a given afternoon. That would be a permissible answer to that question. How much violence is there on television? Or how about the question, are seatbelts effective at preventing injury? Stating seatbelts are uncomfortable is not an appropriate answer, not an appropriate conclusion to that issue. What would be? Are seatbelts effective at preventing injury? Yes, seatbelts are effective at preventing injury. Or no, seatbelts are not effective at preventing injury. These are the only permissible answers to this question. And really, with a factual issue, only one of them can be right. So a conclusion. How do you detect a conclusion? How do you detect a conclusion in somebody else's argument? Or how do you detect someone's conclusion when they don't explicitly state it? Right? So ask yourself, there's some words you could just look for. If someone says thus, or hence, or therefore I believe such and such, oftentimes that is the person's conclusion. It is the answer to the question that they either explicitly stated or implied. Or here's what I believe. Oh, this person is about to lay some conclusion on you. For example, I believe there is too much violence on television. My point is executives make too much money, right? This is a person giving you their conclusion to the question that they either explicitly stated or implied over the course of their argument. So ask yourself the question. Ask yourself the question, what is this person's point of view? What is this person trying to say is true about the world? That is that person's conclusion. Make sense? Hopefully it does. If not, make sure to ask in the forum below. And remember, as we're going through these video lectures, make sure if you are coming up with questions or anything that I'm talking about is confusing, make sure to use the appropriate forum. This one is called Argument Forum, to ask the question. Like, I didn't understand what you meant by such and such. I didn't understand what you meant by so-and-so. Like, you talked about factual issues, and I didn't really understand how they were different than value issues. Can you give me a couple more examples? Then I can do that in the forum, and everyone can benefit from your question. And then there's just a joke in slide 18. Ha, ha, ha. Really, and this joke is just supposed to get at the idea that it is supposed to sort of illustrate for you that an argument is not simply a question and an answer, right? The third essential component to any technical argument are the reasons, which we broach in slide 19. The reasons are people's backup, right? If I say, who should do the dishes tonight? You should do the dishes tonight. I have not made an argument. That is not an argument. A question, which we call an issue, and a conclusion is not an argument. It's an argument once you provide at least a single reason for your point of view. Once you've provided a reason, now you have an argument. Maybe it's not a very good argument, but at least you have one. Issue, reasons, and conclusion. Some synonyms for reasons are premises, like my premise about the world is such and such. That would be like, for example, if I say, who should do the dishes tonight? You should do the dishes tonight. I have done dishes every night for the last month. That I have done dishes every night for the last month is my premise about the world. That is what I'm presuming is true. That's the evidence that I'm providing to you to back up my point of view about you needing to do the dishes and as opposed to me, right? Another synonym for reasons or evidence. The evidence that I'm giving to you for why someone else should do the dishes and not me is another word for my reasons. Also called support, often called justification as well. This is your backup. You're not just here's my opinion about the world, but here's why my opinion is the right one. Those are your reasons. And without reasons, you don't have an argument. You just have a point of view. A good argument, and well, even a bad argument, has issues, reasons, which is your evidence or support, and conclusion. So slide 20. How can you detect a reason? I use something called the because trick. If I'm reading somebody's persuasive essay, which I definitely see in your future, if I'm reading somebody's persuasive essay or I'm reading someone's argument and I'm trying to go, okay, well, what's the issue here? What's the question under debate? What's this person's point of view? What are they trying to say is true about the world? That's their conclusion. And what are their reasons? If I could stick a because in front of their statement, whether or not they use the word because at all, if I could theoretically shove a because in front of that person's statement, I know I've detected a reason or a piece of evidence or a premise, right? So look for that word because, or put it in front of a statement and see if it works there. If it does, you've probably stumbled across somebody's reasons, right? There's lots of different kinds of reasons that a person can give you. Right? A person can give you examples from their own life about, hey, here's my experience and here's some evidence for what I believe. They can give you statistics from research studies. They can make a cool metaphor where they're going, hey, this thing is like this other thing. Or they can say, hey, this expert who is a legitimate expert believes this, and here's what they have to say on the topic. All of this, all the supporting material becomes a part of someone's reasons for their conclusion. Other words that often will allow you to detect a reason in somebody's argument are things like firstly, secondly, I believe this because there's evidence that suggests such and such. Furthermore, in addition, all of these are just sort of tricks for detecting people's reasons. These little words that often go in front of people's evidence. So let's come up with one more argument before we move on to slide 21 to sort of really illustrate what a reason is. So does violence on television lead to greater aggression in children? And I say, well, several controlled research studies have manipulated how much violence on TV children watch. And those research studies show that after watching large amounts of violent television, children became more aggressive. Therefore, I do think that watching violent television can lead to greater aggression in children. All of that discussion that I just gave you about that research, all of that, me describing that research study to you, was my supporting evidence. That was my reason. The issue was whether or not violence on TV led to aggression. That was my issue. My conclusion was only the part at the end, that yes, I think it does lead to greater aggression. That was my conclusion at the end. Everything else in the middle were my reasons, my evidence, my premises. And so that sort of concludes our sort of discussion, our technical discussion of what an argument is, what our technical definition of an argument is. And so what I would suggest that you do is practice coming up with arguments and use the forum to make sure that you can create an effective argument or create any argument at all. Make sure you can come up with an issue, with a matching conclusion, and then some reasons that support that issue. Because what I see in your future is the ability to do that, to come up with a specific issue that has a very specific conclusion that matches it with some reasons that support it in the center. So once again, here is an example of an accurate argument. An accurate argument. Who should do the dishes tonight? You should do the dishes tonight. Do you see how I have answered my specific question? Now here are my reasons. I am tired from working all day. You did not work all day. You should do the dishes tonight. Those two statements I said, I'm tired after working all day. You did not work today. Those become my reasons for my matching conclusion. You should do the dishes tonight. Hopefully, this discussion made a lot of sense to you. And again, if you have any confusion at all, now once again, if you have any confusion at all, just use that forum, that forum down there to ask me any question you like. So, I will see you next time, where we'll actually delve into values and ethics. And I look forward to chatting with you virtually then.